On a still icy evening at the very end of November, Royal Lodge looked nothing like the home it had been for decades. The trees stood bare against a pale sky, their branches clicking softly in the wind, and a thin sheet of frost clung to the long driveway where cars once lined up for summer garden parties. Tonight the air felt abandoned, suspended in a kind of winter silence that only arrives when something has ended long before anyone speaks it aloud. Inside, the dim lamps cast warm pools of light across half-packed boxes, and folded drapes' footsteps echoed gently now, not cushioned by routine or comfort, but hollow, as if the house already sensed it was losing the two people who had defined its walls for so long. And in the center of that fading warmth stood Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, staring at the fireplace as though it could answer questions he hadn't yet dared to say out loud. He was no longer Prince Andrew. He was no longer Duke of York. He was simply a man stripped of identity, waiting for the last door in his world to close. The humiliation had been steady, relentless. Charles' final decision in October, the headlines that followed, the staff reductions, the warnings, the day line to vacate Royal Lodge before winter deepened, and now as November slipped into its final days, Andrew found himself facing the one person who had stayed beside him when the rest of the monarchy stepped back. Sarah Ferguson. She entered quietly, almost cautiously, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea for warmth. For nearly 30 years she had absorbed Andrew's storms, defended what she could, endured what she couldn't, and walked the fragile line between loyalty and self-preservation. But tonight felt different. The air between them carried a tension she hadn't felt before, something darker, heavier. Andrew turned toward her, not with gratitude or sorrow, but with a resolve sharpened by weeks of anger and desperation. And in that still room among the boxes and fading embers, he spoke the words that would shatter what remained between them, words not of fear, not of regret, but of demand. To understand why that November night carried such weight, we must step back to the weeks preceding it, weeks shaped by consequences, years in the making, decisions no longer avoidable, the other quiet unraveling of two intertwined lives inside the British monarchy. For Andrew, the turning point had come earlier in the autumn. King Charles, facing intensified scrutiny after renewed discussion surrounding the Epstein scandal and the posthumous release of Virginia Giuffre's memoir, made a decision that had been delayed for far too long. Andrew's remaining privileges, the fragments of honor that had survived previous storms, were removed with a final, irrevocable order. His title, his style, his standing, all gone. What stung most wasn't the public announcement, though, that alone sent shockwaves through every newspaper in Britain and the United States. It was what followed: the instructions that Andrew must vacate Royal Lodge, the estate he had lived in for decades, the last physical reminder of his former life. And he wasn't being relocated to a grand residence or a formal grace and favor property. The arrangement proposed was modest, scaled down, and painful in its symbolism, a reminder that the monarchy had closed its doors to him. Sarah Ferguson experienced her own spiral at the same time. The resurfacing of the email in which she had once referred to Jeffrey Epstein as a steadfast, generous, supreme friend left her cornered in public once more. Charities that had partnered with her for years began to step back, quietly unwilling to weather the renewed association. Even those who sympathized with her could not deny her proximity to the turbulence that had consumed Andrew's life inside Royal Lodge. The atmosphere shifted day by day. Staff who had served a home for years began seeking other placements. Rooms once filled with chatter fell silent, and the house, now lined with packing boxes, felt like a closing chapter. What kept Andrew and Sarah together through all of this wasn't love in the romantic sense that had faded long ago, but a strange unspoken bond formed through years of survival. They had weathered disgrace, rebuilding, financial instability, and periods of public cruelty. They had raised daughters together. They had leaned on one another when the monarchy held them at arm's length. Yet pressure does not always unite. Sometimes it forces hidden fractures to the surface. As winter crept into the grounds of Windsor and the end of November approached, Andrew's youth Humiliation deepened into something sharper, something that would soon push him to a breaking point, and Sarah, already fragile under her own storms, was about to face the consequence of that breaking point. The first signs that something inside Andrew had shifted were so idle at first, small changes in routine, in tone, in the way he moved through Royal Lodge, as if the walls themselves were shrinking around him. Sarah Ferguson noticed these changes not because she was looking for them, but because she had lived alongside Andrew long enough to recognize the early tremors of a larger collapse. It began in mid-November when the final letters from the palace arrived confirming the timetable for his relocation. The wording was careful, sterile, almost painfully polite, but Sarah knew how Andrew heard it. Every sentence felt like a reminder that he no longer belonged in the world he was born into, and every reminder chipped away at the last pieces of stability he had left. He stopped joining her for breakfast. He stopped speaking unless spoken to. He walked the halls late at night, pausing at framed photographs, as though trying to determine which memories were still his, and which ones had already been taken from him. The second sign came during a conversation Asian with Beatrice and Eugenie. Both daughters had tried gently to steer their father toward acceptance, reminding him that this transition did not mean they were abandoning him. But Andrew could no longer distinguish between losing a home and losing a family. He interpreted every piece of advice, every attempt to comfort him, as confirmation that even his own children believed he had become a burden. Sarah watched the tension grow behind his eyes, a kind of quiet fury that made the room feel cold even when the fireplace was burning brightly. But the real shift came when the media began releasing excerpts from Virginia Giuffre's memoir. Though the book had been completed before her death, its publication reopened every wound Andrew thought had scabbed over. Commentators revisited old interviews. Analysts, they say, acted his denials, his settlement, his past friendships. American networks replayed clips from his infamous BBC interview. British newspapers ran headlines in tones that blended scandal with condemnation. Sarah felt the impact of it. Her own email to Epstein resurfaced in the coverage, dragging her name back into the narrative she had spent years trying to escape. Charities quietly removed her from upcoming events. Invitations stopped appearing. Even routine meetings were postponed indefinitely. She tried to hide how much it hurt, but Andrew saw it, and instead of sympathy, it ignited something bitter inside him. The third sign arrived when Andrew began comparing his situation to Harry and Meghan's. He brought up Frogmore Cottage more than once, muttering that even they, with all the drama they had caused, had enjoyed privileges he now envied. At least they chose their exile, he said one evening. I am being pushed into mine. Sarah knew then that the humiliation had taken root in him in a way she could not undo. Andrew was beginning to measure his own downfall not by facts, but by resentments. As November drew to a close, the fourth sign emerged, the one that frightened Sarah the most. Andrew began assigning blame, not loudly, not violently, but with the quiet sharpness of a man who felt cornered. He blamed the palace for surrendering to public pressure. He blamed the media for refusing to let the past stay buried. He blamed the advisors Charles relied on. He even blamed William, calling him ruthlessly practical, which Sarah interpreted as cold, or he will not save me. And then slowly Andrew's frustration began circling back toward her. It wasn't direct, it wasn't cruel, it was something worse, a quiet implication that if Sarah had made better choices in the past, different friendships, different emails, different strategies, perhaps the storm wouldn't be quite so severe. Sarah absorbed it silently. She always had, but this time something inside her tightened. The fifth and final sign came on a day when she found Andrew standing alone in the empty dining room, staring at a list of staff members who would not be moving with him. The names were people who had known him for decades. Individuals he once greeted with warmth. Now their departure felt like further confirmation that he had become a man no one wanted to stand beside. He turned to Sarah then, and she saw it clearly, a man no longer grieving what he had lost, but preparing to dump something he believed he was owed. And in that moment, she understood the breaking point was coming, and she would be the one standing closest when it arrived. By the final week of November, the atmosphere surrounding Royal Lodge had become so heavy that even senior Palestine Steph spoke about it in lowered voices. The estate, once a symbol of comfort and continuity for Andrew and Sarah, now felt like a stage set for an ending, and the royal family, whether they admitted it or not, could feel the tension tightening across their winter schedules inside the palace. Discussions about Andrew had grown sharper, more decisive, not because anyone wished him cruelty, but because the monarchy had entered a period where its survival depended on discipline. Crisis fatigue had set in. The Queen was gone. Charles's reign was fragile. Catherine's health remained a sensitive topic. William and then we're taking on more duties than ever, and the public, especially in America, judged each misstep with the force of a global conversation. So when reports reached the palace that Andrew had begun shifting blame onto Sarah, that he was spiraling again, the reactions revealed more about each senior royal than any formal statement could, and was the first to speak her mind, as she often was during a small winter briefing held inside Windsor Castle. She set her glasses down and looked directly at Charles. "You cannot keep rescuing him," he said firmly. "Every time we soften, he takes another step into denial. This isn't about punishment. This is about honesty." Charles didn't answer immediately. He often carried the softness for Andrew, the softness of an older brother who had watched a sibling fall further than he ever imagined. And words carried weight. They always did. Camilla, sitting at Charles's side, sighed softly. Of all the senior royals, she understood scandal. Oh, better than anyone. She understood how long it lingered, how stubbornly had clung to her family's image. "The charities dropping Sarah is the real warning sign," she murmured. "It means the public doesn't want proximity to any of this, not again. And certainly not now." William's view: "I was the most cold, the most strategic, and in many ways the most necessary. We're preparing for a transition," he said simply. "My father's reign needs stability. If Andrew cannot face reality, we cannot shape policy around his refusal." He wasn't cruel. He wasn't emotional. He was focused on the monarchy as an institution, not a family. And that, Sarah understood later, was what Andrew resented most. William would not throw him a lifeline, not with the crown under pressure, not with Catherine's limited public schedule, and not with the international spotlight growing sharper every month. Meanwhile, in California, the Sussexes found themselves pulled inadvertently into the story. A journalist on an American morning show compared Andrew's housing crisis to the time Harry and Meghan last Frogmore Cottage. The clip went viral. It wasn't fair. The circumstances were entirely different, but the comparison gained traction regardless. It placed Andrew in the uncomfortable position of appearing worse off than a couple who had voluntarily stepped back from royal life, and Andrew hated that comparison. Back at Royal Lodge, Sarah tried to hold the unraveling threads together. She checked on staff, she managed logistics, she took calls from their daughters, and she tried gently repeated to soften Andrew's anger before it turned into something sharper. But the more she tried, the more he recoiled. Humiliation does strange things to a man. It reshaped his pride, it distorts his reality. One evening, as they sat in the fading warmth of the drawing room, Andrew finally let his frustration show. "They want to see me crawl," he muttered. Charles William owned, "Even in they want to see me shrink down to nothing." Sarah shook her head. "They want to move forward. They want the institution to survive." "The institution," Andrew snapped. "And what about the people? Lynette, what about the people who have given their lives to it?" Sarah didn't answer. She knew better than to argue with a man drowning in his own grief. Meanwhile, the press began speculating about whether Sarah would stay with Andrew after the move. Some articles suggested she was preparing to leave for Portugal. Others claimed she was considering a small granny annex on her daughter's property. None of it was confirmed. Even Sarah didn't fully know what she would do. The winter deepened, boxes multiplied, staff numbers dwindled, and the quiet between Andrew and Sarah grew longer, heavier. By the last days of November, those closest to the situation began whispering that something inside Royal Lodge had finally snapped, that Andrew, pushed too far by humiliation, pressure, and fear, had crossed a line with Sarah. If you are watching this now, I would be honored to know from which country or city you are joining us. Your perspective adds depth to how these royal stories are understood across the world, and I invite you to share it in the comments with respect and thoughtfulness, because what happened next in a dim hallway lit only by a fading lamp would go on to redefine not only Andrew's fall, but Sarah's future. It was the moment the man she had stood beside for nearly 3 decades issued a demand so startling, so unexpected, that even those who had seen the worst of royal drama felt a chill, and that demand would turn the private sorrow inside Royal Lodge into a breaking point, and neither of them could avoid the breaking point arrived on a freezing night at the end of November, when the wind outside Royal Lodge howled through the empty chimneys like an omen. Most of the house was already packed up, the carpets had been rolled, the portraits taken down, even the familiar scent of the place polished wood and old books had faded under the cold draft that slipped through every gap. It was almost poetic, Sarah thought our home could say. Since when its story was ending, Andrew was pacing again. He had barely slept for days, drifting between anger and despair, between silence and muttering, between blaming others and blaming himself. His footsteps echoed sharply against the hardwood floors, now stripped of rugs, sounding more like a man trapped than a man preparing to leave. Sarah watched him from the doorway, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She had lived alongside Andrew long enough to recognize the warning signs, the tightening shoulders, the clipped breathing, the sudden stillness before he spoke. But tonight felt different. Tonight felt like he was about to cross an internal threshold he could never step back from. He stopped pacing. The room fell silent. "Sarah," he said without turning around. She waited, bracing herself. He finally faced her, his expression stern, wounded, and edged with something desperate. "You can't go on like this." He began, "running from journalists, losing patronage, is letting the charities drop you. And I won't drag you with me when I move." Sarah blinked. She wasn't expecting a conversation about her. She had prepared herself for another tirade about Charles or William or the memoir or the press, but instead, "Ed," he continued, "if we're going to get through this, you have to make a choice." Her breath caught. This wasn't concern. This wasn't protection. This was a prelude. Andrew moved closer, lowering his voice as though the empty rooms around them still held ears. "You either so with me fully wherever I'm relocated, however I'm restricted, or you stay behind and distance yourself entirely, publicly, officially." Sarah stared at him, trying to understand. "Distance myself? Yes," he said sharply. "You stop speaking about me, sir. Stop appearing with me. Stop using my name to stay relevant in the press. And if the palace or the media ask you, make it clear that the mistakes of the past were not shared mistakes." There it was, the demand, the one she had feared without admitting it to herself. He wasn't just asking her to say, "Step back," he was asking her to take the fall alone. She felt her throat tighten. "Andrew, after everything, after 30 years, after raising 2 daughters, after protecting you and no one else, this isn't about the past," he snapped. "This is about survival." Sarah froze, not because of the words themselves, but because of the tone. She had heard many sides of Andrew, the charming one, the arrogant one, the defensive one, the devastated one. But this was a new voice, a voice shaped by fear so deep it had turned into cold calculation. "Do you realize what you're asking?" she whispered. "I'm asking you," he said, "to keep me from being destroyed any further. And if that means stepping back from you, or you stepping back from me, then it must be done." The silence that followed was unbearable. Sarah looked around the room at the empty shelves, the dim light, the boxes labeled with the remnants of their lives. She remembered the early year. Here's the laughter, the chaos, the unconventional bond that survived long after their marriage had ended. She remembered defending him in interviews, shielding him from attacks, helping him find footing when he stumbled. And now he wanted her to erase herself to save him. Her voice trembled. "Not with fear, but with clarity." "You're asking me to disappear," she said. "I'm asking you," he replied, "to choose." It was the final blow, the moment every unspoken fracture between them broke open. Outside, the wind pushed against the windows, rattling the glass. A strange, fitting applause for the collapse happening inside Royal Lodge. And with that, the partnership that had survived scandal, exile, and decades of public scrutiny finally reached its point of no return. The aftermath of Andrew's ultimatum unfolded not in shouts or slow "I'm doors," but in a chilling quiet that settled over Royal Lodge like the frost outside. Something between them had broken, not suddenly, but finally, and the crack echoed far beyond the empty corridors of the house. For the first time in decades, Sarah Ferguson no longer knew whom she was standing beside the morning after the confrontation. The staff noticed the shift instantly. Sarah, usually the one to offer a warm greeting, even on difficult days, moved through the house with a distant Russian. She avoided the drawing room where the argument had taken place. Andrew, meanwhile, shot himself in his study, emerging only to take brief terse calls from advisors trying to coordinate his relocation. Even the remaining staff whispered that the tension had become unbearable. Almost suffocating news from Windsor made matters worse. Charles received a private briefing outlining Andrew's refusal to accept scaled-down accommodations and Sandringham, without a full support rota of staff, a demand that once leaked painted him as stubbornly detached from reality. Some palace aides described it as tone-deaf, others simply called it tragic, and the public reaction in both the UK and the United States hardened sharply. Commentators pointed out that Andrew was still asking for luxuries when even his most basic status had already been stripped away. For Sarah, the humiliation was double-edged. She